The sun was beginning its slow descent behind a row of stately, tree-lined streets in a quiet suburban town. The air was crisp with the last breath of autumn, and the leaves painted in shades of amber and gold gently floated down to the perfectly manicured lawns below. The houses, each with their white picket fences and American flags fluttering lazily in the breeze, created an image of tranquility that seemed too perfect to be real. This was Brighton Springs, a picturesque town where everyone knew everyone, and the pulse of life beat to a rhythm that never strayed too far from the familiar. The streets were calm, dotted with children playing in their yards, joggers pacing the sidewalks, and elderly couples walking hand in hand, their faces etched with years of shared memories. On the surface, it seemed like the epitome of suburban serenity. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a travel brochure, designed to sell the idea of peaceful, small-town living. But beneath the calm, an undercurrent of tension lingered, as if the idyllic facade was only skin deep. And Marcus had always been aware of it. He was a 17-year-old black teen, walking through the neighborhood with a basketball tucked under his arm, his sneakers making soft echoes against the concrete as he strolled down the street. His dark eyes were fixed ahead, but his mind was elsewhere, thinking about the game he'd just finished at the park. The sound of the ball bouncing against the pavement still echoed in his ears. There was a quiet confidence in the way he walked, his head held high, shoulders straight. But there was also something in his expression, something that hinted at the weight of his thoughts. Marcus had always loved basketball. It wasn't just a sport, it was his escape, his way of channeling the chaos of his mind into something productive. The court at the park had been his sanctuary where he could be free from the weight of judgment, free from the stares he often received in this predominantly white town. But today, the familiar mix of determination and contemplation on his face seemed to carry a bit more gravity. The truth was, Marcus was no stranger to being watched. Living in Brighton Springs, he had learned early on that some eyes saw him as different. Not because of the way he carried himself, or how he interacted with others, but because of the color of his skin. It wasn't something he often voiced out loud, but it was something he could feel in the air, as palpable as the smell of rain before a storm. As he made his way down the tree-lined street, the quiet hum of suburban life seemed to pause for a moment. Marcus had always been aware of the subtle stares, the way the older residents seemed to scrutinize him just a bit more closely than others. The neighborhood had never quite accepted him. Oh, they weren't overtly hostile. No one would ever say anything directly to his face, but those whispers followed him wherever he went. He would walk past groups of people chatting on their porches, only to feel the shift in energy, the moment their conversation would falter when they saw him. He wasn't the first black person to live in Brighton Springs, but he was definitely one of the few. The community was largely made up of families who had lived in the same houses for generations. They were mostly white, mostly conservative, and largely stuck in their ways. At times, Marcus found solace in his solitude. He could get lost in his thoughts, in his own world, where the constant tension wasn't there. But other times it gnawed at him, making him feel like an outsider in a place where he should feel at home. Today, though, it was different. He could sense that the familiar feeling of discomfort was heavier than usual. Maybe it was just his nerves, or maybe it was because the season was changing, and things always felt a little more unsettled when the weather shifted. But either way, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. As he approached the corner of the street, he spotted a figure standing on the porch of a house up ahead. Ms. Thompson. The sight of her made Marcus pause for a fraction of a second. She was standing there, just as she did most afternoons, watching the world go by, her hands resting on the railing. Ms. Thompson had been a constant presence in the neighborhood for as long as Marcus could remember. She was one of the oldest residents of the town, and everyone knew her by name. She was a middle-aged white woman, known for her conservative views and her tendency to speak her mind. In her eyes, Marcus didn't belong here. He had never been outright rude or hostile to her, but she was one of those people who saw his presence in the neighborhood as an inconvenience. She had lived here for decades, and she believed it was her responsibility to keep the neighborhood safe. Safe from what? Marcus wasn't sure, but it was clear that she viewed him with suspicion. As Marcus walked past, he couldn't help but notice the way her eyes narrowed slightly, watching his every move. She didn't smile, didn't wave like the other neighbors might have. Instead, she just stood there, arms crossed, her sharp gaze following him like a hawk watching its prey. Marcus kept his eyes straight ahead and kept walking. He'd seen that look before. He'd felt the weight of it on him for as long as he could remember. It wasn't a look of kindness. It wasn't a look of familiarity. It was the look of someone who saw him as an outsider. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. He tried to push the thought away, but there was something unsettling in her gaze. It felt deliberate, intentional. As Marcus continued down the street, he tried to focus on the sound of his sneakers against the pavement, the rhythmic dribble of the basketball against his hand. But he couldn't help but feel that the eyes of the world were on him. He had learned early in life that being black in a mostly white neighborhood meant he had to be careful. It wasn't about being too loud or too assertive, it was about being seen, being noticed. And the moment you were noticed, you were judged. He had seen it in the way people would clutch their bags a little tighter when he passed them in the store, or how they would cross the street when they saw him walking alone. It wasn't about being a threat, it was about the fear of the unknown. The fear of someone who didn't fit the mold of what the town had always known. Somewhere deep inside, Marcus had become accustomed to the tension. He had learned to brush it off, to ignore the stares and the whispers, to carry himself with the confidence that came from knowing who he was, regardless of how the world saw him. But today, the weight of it felt more pronounced. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen, that the tension he'd been carrying with him for years was about to boil over. As he turned the corner, he saw the familiar porch swing on the Thompsons' front porch. There she was again, Ms. Thompson, standing tall as always, arms crossed, watching Marcus like a hawk. This time she didn't even try to hide it. Her eyes were locked onto him, unwavering. There was a hint of something dark in her gaze, a sense of judgment that cut through the air between them. Marcus kept walking, but his senses were on high alert. He could feel the change in the atmosphere, the shift in the way the world felt around him. There was a sense of impending doom. Something was going to happen. Have you ever been judged unfairly? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you were scrutinized just because of how you looked or who you were? Share your experiences with us in the comments below. How did you handle the situation? Let's talk about it. It was just another afternoon in Brighton Springs. The sun was now dipping lower, casting long shadows across the streets, and the stillness of the town made it feel like time had slowed down. Marcus, with his basketball in hand, approached the familiar driveway of Ms. Kelly's house. He had spent countless hours here, shooting hoops with friends or just practicing his layups and jump shots alone. It was one of the few places where he could be himself, without feeling the watchful eyes of the world on him. Ms. Kelly's driveway had a basketball hoop at the end, its backboard cracked in places from years of use, but still standing strong. The rim hung a little lower than it should, making the shots just a tad easier. Marcus loved the imperfections of the court. It was his space, his haven. He dropped his bag beside the driveway and bounced the ball a couple of times, preparing himself for a few rounds of practice. But before he could even take his first shot, something shifted in the air. Ms. Thompson's eyes followed Marcus the moment he stepped into the driveway. Her gaze, sharp and unwavering, sized him up as he positioned himself on the asphalt, adjusting his sneakers, ready to shoot. She stood still on her porch, watching him intently. At first her eyes were narrowed with suspicion, but as Marcus dribbled the ball and took his first shot, her gaze deepened into a full, unblinking stare. There was something in her eyes, something more than mere curiosity or concern. It was a look of judgment, a look that felt almost predatory, like she was waiting for something to go wrong. As the ball swished through the net, Marcus smiled to himself, thinking about the next shot he would take, completely unaware of what was unfolding across the street. Inside her house, Ms. Thompson stood in the shadows, clutching the phone in her hand. She hesitated for a moment, her thumb hovering over the buttons. Then, with a decisive motion, she dialed the number she had called more than once before, although not always in the same context. 911. What's your emergency? The operator's voice came through the receiver, cheerful but professional. I need to report a suspicious young man, Ms. Thompson said, her voice calm but tinged with something colder, something that betrayed her true feelings. I've seen him hanging around the neighborhood before, and now he's loitering outside one of the homes on Maple Street, just watching the house. I think he's up to no good. She didn't mention that the young man was just shooting hoops or minding his own business. She didn't care to explain that Marcus was a part of the neighborhood, a kid who had been coming here for years. All that mattered to Ms. Thompson was that he didn't belong in her version of the community. To her, a black teenager in the neighborhood was automatically seen as a threat, regardless of the circumstances. Her finger trembled slightly as she pressed the final digit, and then she spoke her address, giving just enough details to ensure the police would show up. The peaceful, quiet suburb suddenly broke into a frenzy. The wail of sirens sliced through the calm air, growing louder and louder and louder as they approached Ms. Kelly's street. Marcus had just taken a shot, the ball soaring through the air with effortless grace, when he heard the unmistakable sound of sirens. At first, he didn't think much of it. Sirens were a regular part of the suburban landscape, a distant noise that meant nothing more than a passing emergency vehicle on the main road. But then, the sirens didn't fade away. The sound grew closer, sharper. Marcus turned around, the ball still in his hands, and saw 2 police cruisers pulling up near the driveway. The officers were all business, their faces stern, their eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of trouble. The moment Marcus saw the police, his heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his chest. Without thinking, he lowered the basketball and placed it on the ground, his hands instinctively rising just a little. It was a gesture of submission, an unspoken sign of compliance. He had learned long ago that the best way to deal with this kind of situation was to remain calm and cooperative, even if he had done nothing wrong. He had seen it too many times before: black men, young and old, being treated with suspicion, being treated as a threat simply because of the color of their skin. The officers didn't hesitate. One of them, a tall man with a grizzled face and an air of authority, stepped forward. His hand rested on the holster of his gun, and his eyes locked onto Marcus with an intensity that was unsettling. The other officer, a younger woman with a neutral expression, stood at the ready, watching Marcus carefully. "Is everything all right here?" the officer asked, his tone flat, as if this was a routine interaction. Marcus stood still, his mind racing as he fought to keep his composure. "Yeah, I'm just practicing basketball, sir," he said, his voice calm but tinged with the slightest hint of uncertainty. The officer didn't reply immediately. Instead, his eyes scanned Marcus's appearance, his clothing, his stance, his face. It was as though he was trying to find something that didn't fit, something that would justify this sudden encounter. He glanced back at the woman officer, who nodded, her hand still hovering near her own weapon. "You're sure you're not causing any trouble?" the officer continued, his voice cold and authoritative. Marcus felt the heat of frustration rising in his chest, but he said nothing. He couldn't speak out of turn. He couldn't show anger. He had learned that lesson the hard way: anger could escalate the situation. But in his mind he was fuming. Why did they always think I was up to something? From her window, Ms. Thompson watched the scene unfold, her face a mixture of satisfaction and impatience. She hadn't expected the officers to take so long. After all, wasn't it obvious? She had called the police for a reason. She had seen Marcus there too many times, and now she was sure her suspicion was correct. He wasn't just some kid shooting hoops. He was an intruder, an outsider, someone who didn't belong. She felt a strange sense of pride as she saw the officers approach Marcus. In her mind, she had done the right thing. She had called for help when something didn't seem right. And now, the police were handling the situation the way they should. She couldn't help but glance back at the scene every few moments, her eyes trained on Marcus, watching his every move. She felt justified, like she had finally done something about the problem. It wasn't like the other neighbors had the guts to speak up, but she did. She knew something was wrong with the way the neighborhood was changing, and this was her way of putting things right. As Marcus stood there, surrounded by the officers, Ms. Thompson's gaze never wavered. There was a small smile on her lips, one that suggested a hidden satisfaction and unspoken belief that this was what needed to happen. As the officers questioned him, Marcus could feel his chest tighten with frustration. His mind raced, full of memories of similar encounters: the stares in the grocery store, the uneasy glances at school, the whispered comments in passing. He had lived this over and over again, and it always felt the same. Being seen as a threat, being assumed to be guilty, just because of the color of his skin. Every time this happened, a part of him wanted to shout, wanted to speak up, to let them know that he wasn't the problem. But he couldn't. He had learned early on that speaking out, even when you're in the right, could make things worse. So, he stood there, his body tense, his hands still raised slightly. He couldn't let his anger show. He had to stay calm. Stay calm, stay calm, he repeated in his head like a mantra. He closed his eyes for a moment, just for a second, and allowed himself to slip into his thoughts, away from the officers and MS. Thompson's watchful gaze. He thought about the time he was pulled over by the police on his way home from a late-night study session. He remembered how his hands shook as he was asked for his ID, how the officer had scrutinized his every move as if he were some criminal. Is it always going to be like this? He wondered. Will I ever not be a threat in someone else's eyes? Just as Marcus began to feel the weight of the situation threatening to overwhelm him, a voice broke through the tension. "Excuse me, officers," came a calm yet firm voice from behind him. Marcus turned, relieved to see MS. Kelly, the woman whose house he had been standing in front of. MS Kelly was a kind, older woman who had known Marcus for years. She had always treated him with respect, ever since he first moved into the neighborhood. She had seen him grow from a shy little boy into the confident young man he was now. When she saw the officers surrounding Marcus, her heart sank. She couldn't just stand by and watch this happen. "I know this young man," she said, stepping forward, her voice steady and clear. "Marcus is a well-behaved kid. He comes here all." The quiet tension that had built up over the past few minutes felt like it might break at any moment. Marcus stood there, his arms still slightly raised, the police officer's eyes trained on him as if he were some criminal they needed to control. Miss Kelly stood nearby, offering what comfort she could, but the situation felt unbearable. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, frustration, anger, confusion, and despite his best efforts to remain composed, his heart pounded in his chest. The officer's words, their skeptical stares, and MS. Thompson's unwavering gaze from her window weighed down on him like an unrelenting storm. Just when it seemed like the tension could stretch no further, an unexpected sound sliced through the air, the low hum of an engine approaching. A sleek black car turned onto the street, pulling up near the scene with a quiet precision. The officers barely noticed it at first, too wrapped up in their interrogation of Marcus. But as the car slowed and came to a stop, the world seemed to hold its breath. Marcus glanced over at the vehicle, and then froze as he recognized the driver. It was his mother, Mayor Evelyn Carter. The car rolled to a stop, its engine cutting off with a soft click. The door opened, and out stepped Evelyn Carter, tall, composed, her every step deliberate, her expression calm but fierce. She wore the power of her office like a cloak, her presence demanding attention. She was known in Brighton Springs as a progressive force, someone who had worked tirelessly to bring change, to elevate the voices of the marginalized, and to fight for equality. She wasn't just the mayor, she was a symbol of strength and integrity. But seeing her in that moment, standing in the midst of this small suburban street, there was no mistaking the anger in her eyes. The moment the officers saw her, their confidence faltered. The two officers glanced at one another, clearly uneasy, as the reality of who they were dealing with set in. MS. Carter, Mayor, the taller officer muttered, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty as he took a step back. Evelyn walked toward the group, her gaze locked on Marcus, and for a brief second, the world seemed to slow down. Her eyes softened as she approached her son, and the tension in the air lifted, if only for a moment. But that was all it took for Evelyn to realize what was happening, what her son had been subjected to in her absence. "Marcus," she said, her voice filled with a protective tenderness as she placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him in that moment. "Are you okay?" Marcus nodded, though he could feel the simmering rage that had been building inside him since the first officer arrived. The situation had escalated, but now, his mother, the one person he trusted most, was here, and everything changed. The officers stood still, unsure of how to proceed. They had come to this street expecting to handle a suspicious character, not the mayor herself. Their unease was palpable. Evelyn turned her gaze from Marcus to the officers, her calm exterior betraying nothing of the whirlwind of emotions brewing beneath the surface. She looked at each officer and turned her gaze sharp, as if she could see straight through them. Her voice, when she spoke, was measured but firm. "I'll take it from here," Evelyn said. "I would like to know why my son is being treated this way." The taller officer opened his mouth to respond, but stopped, hesitating as if trying to find the right words. "We received a call about a suspicious person on the property." Suspicious Evelyn interrupted, her voice cold now, her jaw tightening as she shifted her focus to MS Thompson's house, the source of this entire mess. You're telling me that my son is being questioned because he's playing basketball in a driveway. Is that how we define suspicious around here? The officer opened his mouth again, but faltered. He looked to his partner, who was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, before looking back at Evelyn. I understand your concerns, Mayor, but we have to take all calls seriously, and we had reason to approach the individual based on the report, the officer explained, trying to justify his actions. But his voice lacked conviction, as if he too recognized the absurdity of the situation. Evelyn's gaze intensified. The only thing I see here that is truly suspicious, she said, her voice rising slightly, is the fact that my son, who has done nothing wrong, is being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. You've wasted time, made assumptions, and created unnecessary tension. Is that how you protect my community? She paused, the weight of her words sinking in, as the officers exchanged glances. Their discomfort was now more than obvious, and they stood frozen in place, their faces unreadable. It was then that MS Thompson stepped from behind her curtains, pushing open the door with an almost reluctant movement. She made her way to the porch and onto the front lawn, her eyes darting between Evelyn and Marcus, the realization of the moment slowly dawning on her. It was one thing to be suspicious of someone, it was another entirely to face the mayor of the town in the midst of it. MS Carter. I didn't mean any harm, MS, Thompson said, her voice faltering as she walked slowly toward the group. I just thought, well, I thought something was off. Evelyn fixed her eyes on MS Thompson, her gaze unwavering. Something was off, she asked, her voice dripping with controlled fury. You made an assumption based solely on my son's appearance and your own bias. That's what's off. And you've now dragged my son into a situation where he has to defend himself for doing nothing more than practicing basketball. This is the kind of thing I fight against. MS Thompson. The kind of ignorance that turns innocent people into suspects because of their race. That's what's off. The silence hung heavy in the air, the weight of Evelyn's words settling on everyone present. MS Thompson, who had once stood so resolutely on her porch, now seemed smaller, almost diminished by the power of the mayor's words. MS Thompson began, but her voice trailed off, her face a mixture of confusion and shame. She was visibly uncomfortable, realizing too late the depth of her mistake. Evelyn's gaze softened, but her stance remained firm. I know you didn't mean harm, but it's time to recognize the harm that's been done. This isn't just about one mistaken call. It's about the bigger picture, the ingrained racism in this town that leads people to act out of fear instead of understanding. The officers shifted uncomfortably, still unsure of how to respond, now caught between the mayor's words and their own actions. They had taken an oath to serve and protect, but in that moment their failure to do so felt palpable. The camera lingered on Marcus's face, capturing the subtle change in his expression. The young man who had once stood in silence, enduring the weight of prejudice alone, now had a quiet pride in his eyes. His mother was here not just as his mom, but as the mayor, someone with power and influence, someone who could stand up and speak truth to power. The look of pride was tempered with a deep sadness, though. He was proud of her, but he also felt the sting of what had just happened, the reminder that no matter how far he came, how much he achieved, his identity as a black man would always make him a target for suspicion. But this moment was more than just a confrontation. It was a shift, a turning point. As Evelyn spoke, standing tall in front of the officers, Marcus felt the weight of her words settle into his heart. This was what it meant to stand up. Not just for yourself, but for others, for everyone who had been wronged, who had been dismissed, who had been forced to walk through life under the shadow of fear and bias. Evelyn's voice, steady and unyielding, was a force that could no longer be ignored. It wasn't just a mother's love that was driving her, it was her responsibility as a leader, her duty to protect and advocate for those who had no voice in the face of injustice. As MS Thompson stood there, visibly shrinking under the weight of the confrontation, Evelyn's words resonated deeply, not just with her, but with everyone who had witnessed the exchange. The camera lingered on the faces of the neighbors, who had slowly gathered around the scene. Some were surprised, some were uncomfortable, but many felt the truth of Evelyn's message. This wasn't just a lesson for MS Thompson, it was a lesson for the whole town. Change would only come when people faced the truth and embraced the challenge of seeing each other as equals. Marcus's emotions were a mix of pride and pain. His mother had stood up for him, and for that he would forever be grateful. But the hurt from this experience, the hurt that came from being treated like a threat in his own home, would take longer to heal. But in that moment, as his mother spoke out for him, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't alone. The officers stood motionless for a moment after Evelyn had finished speaking, their expressions unreadable. They knew they couldn't justify what had just happened, couldn't explain away the assumptions that had led them to approach Marcus in the first place. They exchanged awkward glances, trying to figure out who would speak first. The taller officer cleared his throat, taking a half step forward. We apologize." Marcus's voice was flat, reluctant, as if he didn't quite know how to reconcile the situation. "This shouldn't have happened. We were just doing our job, but we didn't handle it the right way." His words hung in the air, inadequate and lacking any true sense of contrition. Marcus stood there, his arms now at his sides, his body tense but not as tight as before. He had heard apologies before. He had heard them from teachers, from store clerks, from random strangers who apologized for their actions after realizing their mistakes. But no apology could erase the fact that this situation had even occurred. The younger officer followed suit, though her apology was softer, almost apologetic in itself. "We're sorry for the misunderstanding," she murmured. "It was a mistake." The words didn't seem to have the weight they should have. They didn't change what had just happened. They didn't erase the fact that Marcus had been treated as a threat in his own community, solely based on his skin color. Without another word, the officers turned and walked back to their patrol cars. They didn't linger, didn't try to explain further. They climbed into their cruisers, still clearly uncomfortable with the situation, and started their engines. The sound of the tires on the gravel echoed down the street as they pulled away, leaving behind the scene of their failure. Evelyn watched the officers drive off, her eyes narrowed in dissatisfaction. "That's it," she muttered, her voice barely audible. She had hoped for more, a recognition of the harm they had caused, a real conversation about how things needed to change. But instead they had simply left. The apology was just an afterthought, an attempt to move on from the uncomfortable truth without addressing it fully. She exhaled sharply, the weight of the situation still pressing down on her chest. Then she turned to Marcus. Her son was standing there, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. His shoulders were slightly slumped, as if the weight of the entire experience had finally caught up to him. Evelyn stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Marcus, I am so proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You handled that with so much grace. I know it wasn't easy, but you stood your ground, and that's not something every person has the courage to do." She pulled him into a tight hug, holding him close, as if she could protect him from all the injustices of the world in that moment. She fought back the tears that threatened to fall, but she couldn't stop the overwhelming surge of pride and love she felt for her son. She could feel him stiffen in her arms at first, but slowly he relaxed, allowing himself to be held by the woman who had fought for him, not just as a mother, but as the mayor of their town. "It's not fair," Marcus whispered into her shoulder, his voice quiet, but the weight of his words palpable. "Why does it have to be like this? Why do I always have to be the one who gets questioned?" Evelyn's arms tightened around him, and she kissed the top of his head. "I know, baby, I know, but you're not alone in this. We're going to keep fighting, we'll keep pushing for change, and we'll do it together. This isn't the end, Marcus. This is just one battle, and we'll win the war." For a moment, the world outside felt distant. The street, the officers, even MS Thompson, all of it faded into the background as mother and son shared a quiet, intimate moment. In that silence, the weight of the situation still loomed, but there was a sense of peace that came from knowing that they had each other's backs. After a few moments, they broke apart, and Evelyn gave Marcus a small, encouraging smile. She could see the toll the incident had taken on him, but she also saw the quiet resolve beginning to form behind his eyes. He had been through something painful, something that no one should ever have to endure, but now he was stronger for it. He would carry this experience with him, but it would not define him. They walked back to the car, the street now eerily quiet after the chaos that had unfolded. Evelyn unlocked the doors and slid into the driver's seat, while Marcus took his place beside her, the silence stretching between them for a few moments before he finally spoke. "Mom, do you think things will ever really change here?" Marcus asked, his voice soft and full of uncertainty. "I mean, the whole town feels like it's just stuck in the past. They all just look at me like I'm some kind of problem." Evelyn started the car, the engine humming to life, and began to drive slowly down the street, her eyes fixed ahead. She took a deep breath before responding. "I won't lie to you, Marcus. It's going to be a long road. This town, this country, it has a lot of work to do before real change can happen. But that doesn't mean we give up. We can't just sit back and wait for things to magically improve. We have to stand up. We have to speak out. We have to push for what's right." Marcus nodded slowly, his mind processing her words. It was hard to believe that change was possible when it felt like everything was always the same. But his mother had dedicated her life to making things better for people like him, for people who had been overlooked and treated unfairly. If she believed in change, maybe it was worth believing in too. "I get it," Marcus said after a pause. "I just wish it didn't have to be like this. I wish people didn't have to learn this lesson the hard way." Evelyn's gaze softened as she turned the car onto the main road, the lights of the town flickering past them. "It's not easy, I know. But you're strong, Marcus. You have a voice, and it matters. Don't ever forget that." The words lingered in the air as they drove, and for the first time that day, Marcus felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that he would no longer remain silent. His mother had shown him how to stand up, how to fight for what was right. And he was ready to continue the fight, no matter how difficult it might be. Meanwhile, inside her home, Ms. Thompson stood by her window, her hands pressed against the glass as she watched the mayor and her son drive off. The reality of what had just happened was slowly sinking in, and she couldn't push it away, no matter how hard she tried. She had acted out of fear, out of suspicion, and now she had to face the consequences of her actions. She had made an assumption about Marcus simply because of how he looked, without ever taking the time to really see him as a person, someone who belonged in this community, someone who had as much right to be there as anyone else. Her mind raced as she replayed the events in her head. She hadn't meant for it to go this far. She hadn't meant to cause so much harm. But the reality was her actions had been rooted in a deep-seated bias she had never fully confronted. She wasn't ready to admit it yet, not to herself, not to anyone, but she knew she had crossed a line. She watched as the last remnants of the police cruisers disappeared down the street, the silence settling over the neighborhood once again. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, and for the first time she questioned what she had done, what kind of person she had allowed herself to become. A few hours later, Ms. Kelly reached out to Marcus. She had witnessed the entire exchange from her front porch and had seen how the situation had escalated. She had also seen how Evelyn had stepped in, how she had fought not just for her son, but for the truth. "Marcus, I just wanted to let you know that I'm here for you, Miss," Kelly said when he answered the phone. "What happened today, it shouldn't have happened. But I'm proud of how you handled yourself. If you ever need someone to talk to, someone who's been around this town a long time and seen how it works, you know where to find me." Marcus was silent for a moment, his thoughts racing. He had been so focused on the anger and frustration of the situation that he hadn't even realized how many people were silently supporting him. "Thanks, Ms. Kelly. I really appreciate it," he said, his voice sincere. "I'll take you up on that." As he hung up the phone, he felt something shift inside him. The support of people like Ms. Kelly and his mother gave him the strength he needed to keep moving forward. It wasn't just about fighting for himself, it was about fighting for the people who couldn't speak out, for the people who still had to endure the same things he did. This was only the beginning, but Marcus was ready for whatever came next. Weeks had passed since the incident that had rocked the quiet streets of Brighton Springs, but the ripples of that day continued to reverberate through the town, gradually transforming the community. It was a slow and painful process, but it was a start that came from facing uncomfortable truths, speaking out, and challenging the deeply ingrained prejudices that had festered for so long. Mayor Evelyn Carter knew that the battle for change would not be won overnight. She had spent her years in office advocating for equality, for justice, and for the voices of the marginalized to be heard. But this was different. This wasn't just about passing legislation or making speeches, it was about changing hearts and minds, about confronting the biases that had gone unspoken for generations. The turning point came when Evelyn decided to take matters into her own hands, organizing a town hall meeting that would open the door for honest conversations about race, prejudice, and the struggles faced by many in the community. It wasn't an easy decision. She knew there would be resistance, that some people would be uncomfortable or even dismissive. But Evelyn believed in the power of dialogue, in the possibility that if people just listened to each other, they might begin to understand. The town hall was held in the community center, a building that had seen its fair share of events, but never one quite like this. Word of the meeting spread quickly. Flyers were posted in the local coffee shops, and Evelyn's office had sent out personal invitations to residents. The mayor herself would be leading the discussion. As the evening arrived, the room was filled with a mix of people. Some came with open minds, eager to hear what the mayor had to say. Others, like Ms. Thompson, were there reluctantly, unsure of what to expect. Yet there was a palpable energy in the room, a sense that change might be on the horizon. When Evelyn took the stage, the crowd grew silent. She was dressed in a simple but powerful way, her clothes unassuming, but her presence undeniable. She looked out over the crowd, scanning the faces in front of her, many of them familiar. The tension was thick, but it wasn't the hostile kind of tension she had anticipated. It was a tension born of nervous anticipation, a collective understanding that this conversation, though difficult, was necessary. She cleared her throat and spoke, her voice steady and confident. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her tone firm but warm. "I know this isn't an easy conversation to have, but it's one we need to have. This town, like so many others, has a history that we cannot ignore. It has a history of exclusion, of assumptions, and yes, of prejudice. And for too long we've turned a blind eye to it. But that ends now." The room was quiet, the weight of her words sinking in. "I want to make it clear," Evelyn continued, "that the issues we face today are not just problems for some, they're problems for all of us. This town should be a place of belonging for everyone. And if we don't confront these issues head-on, we will never move forward. This isn't just about a few isolated incidents. This is about the way we see each other, the way we treat each other, and the way we make people feel welcome or unwelcome in our community." Her words hung in the air, creating a space for reflection. A few heads nodded, some with apprehension, but others with clear understanding. Evelyn wasn't finished. "Starting tonight," she announced, "I am launching an initiative to promote diversity and tolerance in this town. We will begin with educational programs for our schools, with workshops for our local businesses, and with ongoing conversations like this one. We will address issues of racial injustice, we will teach empathy, and we will learn how to become better neighbors, better friends, and better human beings. This is not about blame, it's about growth. It's about moving forward together." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Some faces remained skeptical, but there were more than a few smiles, small, hesitant smiles, but smiles nonetheless. People were listening. People were starting to think. "I know that change isn't easy," Evelyn said, her voice taking on a softer, more personal tone. "I know that this town has deep roots and that history is hard to shake. But I also know that we are stronger when we come together. We can't change the past, but we can shape the future. And that future begins now." The crowd sat in stunned silence for a moment, absorbing the gravity of the mayor's words. But then, slowly, a round of applause began to spread through the room. It wasn't the kind of applause you'd give for a performance, it was the kind of applause you give when something real has been said, when you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself. The applause grew louder, as if the room was breathing a collective sigh of relief. For the first time in a long time, there was hope in the air. In the weeks that followed, the town started to change. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect, but the seeds of transformation had been planted. The educational programs started in the schools, where students of all ages learned about the importance of diversity and tolerance. The local businesses held training sessions on how to create inclusive environments, how to recognize unconscious bias, and how to welcome everyone, regardless of their background. People began to really talk about race. Conversations that had once been avoided, that had been swept under the rug, were now happening in cafes, living rooms, and at the town hall. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments of discomfort. But there was a sense of collective movement towards something better. Evelyn kept pushing for more. She kept showing up, speaking out, and organizing events that brought the community together. And while not everyone was convinced, the conversations had begun, and that was the most important first step. For Marcus, the experience of that day, the day the officers showed up and his mother stood up for him, was a turning point. It wasn't just about that one moment, but the realization that he didn't have to go through life in isolation. He didn't have to shoulder the burden of racism and prejudice alone. He had his mother, his community, and now he had an entire town that was beginning to see him for who he truly was, a young man with potential, a future, and a right to be here, just like anyone else. In the days following the town hall, Marcus became more vocal. He started attending meetings and contributing to the conversations about change. His voice, once hesitant, once quiet in the face of prejudice, grew stronger. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew that he wasn't fighting it alone anymore. The town was beginning to listen, and he was ready to help guide them through the difficult work of understanding and reconciliation. One afternoon, as Marcus walked back down the street toward his house, he held his basketball under his arm. He had just come from a practice session at the park, and though he was tired, there was a sense of peace in his step that hadn't been there before. As he passed by Ms. Thompson's house, something unexpected happened. For the first time, the older woman was sitting on her porch. As he walked by, she looked up at him, no judgment in her gaze, no suspicion. Just a simple, small nod of acknowledgement. And then, for the first time, she waved. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant to the untrained eye, but to Marcus, it meant the world. It was the beginning of change, a symbolic moment that represented the shift in the air, the beginning of new understandings, new relationships, and new possibilities. As Marcus continued down the street, his mind filled with thoughts of the future, of the work that lay ahead. He knew that there would be more challenges, more moments of discomfort, but he also knew that things were changing. The conversations had begun, the doors were opening, and the town was finally moving forward. What about you, he thought, as he turned the corner and looked ahead toward the horizon. What can you do to make a difference? Have you ever witnessed prejudice in your own community? How did you respond? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. As he walked further, the basketball still resting comfortably under his arm, Marcus smiled to himself. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. If we stand together, we can change the world. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories of resilience, hope, and the power of positive change.